Marion Porath, who has been with us. We'll say more about that later when we're having our little celebration, but been with us 20 years. So, yeah. They're having a presentation this morning called Designs for Development, Retrospect and Prospect. So, Marion.
So, if I stand here, is that going to work in terms of seeing the slides? Okay. And, right. So, I will pick up on the theme of this title as I go through the presentation. But given that I'm at this sort of, 8 days away from retirement, something like that, it is very much a kind of retrospective piece and thinking about where I hope to take aspects of my work as I begin this new phase.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So, you will hear more about this one. Okay. So, I'm going to give you a bit of a background to the presentation, talk about my teaching and research, and then look forward. I am focusing on the developmentally focused aspects of my work today. It's been a major part of what I've done, and it's a big focus now, particularly in this time of transition in my life, having come through along Piagetian and neo-Piagetian theoretical framework. I think a lot in terms of stages and transitions and what happens during those particular phases of life. So, so that will be the focus, but I would like to acknowledge that there have been a couple of other major influences in my work. Worked with Bill on the clinic on ability and development for a number of years, and that was a wonderfully rich experience in terms of gaining clinical experience with highly able children and their families, and with Liz on problem-based learning, doing some fabulously exotic conferences and writing. So thank you both. So my background. I am a Vancouverite, but I grew up in Victoria, and I think both of those landscapes have shaped my love of the aesthetic and my predisposition to things artistic. In revisiting early learning experiences for a current book project, I realized that writing was also a big part of my development. I remember being lost in the process, experiencing flow. That, in addition to being raised by the Queen of Grammar, as my siblings and I called my mother, and being exposed to a wealth of literature gave me an appreciation for the power of language. Also, being the eldest of 3 children probably prepared me in some way for life as a teacher, although my path to becoming a teacher was somewhat circuitous. But certainly, my teaching experience really informed my questions about children's cognitive and social development, particularly with regard to highly able learners. This was one of my first classes, grade 4, West Heights Elementary. 35 children, and was probably 20 of them with special needs. Prior to the days when, they were designated as having special needs, but I think this class taught me so much and really awakened a curiosity for, what goes on in children's minds, and just really stretched me in terms of meeting individual needs. So, this is a bit of writing I have published on teaching. The sensing that I think goes on when you work as a teacher, the things that you pick up in a very subtle fashion around students' expressions and body language and so on, and the dynamics in a classroom. The kind of questioning that one engages in as a teacher as well. I was always very curious about how kids were thinking, why they were thinking what they were thinking, what lay behind their questions, and how they understood things. And so as an elementary teacher, I think now in looking back on that, those were questions that I really brought with me into my graduate work, and the reason that I ended up combining special education with study in developmental psychology. And these are the things I love about teaching. I really do love the complexity of it, and the capacity to see potential in students, and then, as I say, polish that and create it. And the learning that one engages in as a teacher. So, as I say, the questions that I brought into my initial graduate work really stemmed from my teaching experiences. I did my master's here with Pat Arlen, actually, former head of our department, and did it within a Piagetian framework. I had, prior to leaving teaching and coming to do graduate work full-time, worked with a group of very bright children, and I had really some questions about what was going on with them in terms of stage of development. They were around 9 years old, so incredibly bright in so many ways, but still I felt there was something else going on that actually probably might be tied to maturity, because even though they were very bright, there was still that 9-year-old kind of puzzlement, you know, when you would talk about certain abstract concepts. So that brought me into a study of giftedness and where stages of development fit with that. I then moved on to work with Robbie Case on my doctorate. And his work really built on Piaget's and took it from that notion of general stages of development into looking at the stages in a more domain-specific way. Still with some general factors that shape the form and the content of thought, but it was a very exciting time to be studying with him, because students were really investigating different areas of development and looking how they unfolded. And they went the gamut from narrative to drawing development to sight reading notation. Just it was quite exciting. And there was some instructional work that really formed the foundation for what many of us came to call designs for development, because the work that was being done around the way children think about things at certain ages really was found to inform instruction in very powerful ways. And I think what struck me about this work, and what subsequent students of mine told me, is that the work really resonated with our experience as teachers. As Robbie said once, there's, you know, if you are teaching a class of grade 1s, yes, there's many individual pathways to development in that class, but there's still something grade 1-like about them as a group. So this kind of thing encapsulated the work that was being done. So I went on to do a number of studies that looked at different domains of development and to think about what was the progression of thinking in different areas. I was sitting on the bus in Toronto once after completing my doctorate with, you know, planning where I was going to take all this work, right? And thinking, okay, there's Howard Gardner's, at that point, 7 and intelligences. I'll just work my way through those. Didn't quite get there, but I followed up some of the work that had been done with another of Ronnie's students at Oisen, looking at drawing development. So the progression of representing 3 dimensions in 2-dimensional space, and the progression in children's capability to do that. Similarly in narrative and in social understanding. And the core idea around all of this is that I and other researchers in this tradition were searching for what Robbie called central conceptual structures. So these are kind of the core concept in a domain that ties everything together. For example, he hypothesized that in mathematics it's what he called the mental number line. And once you kind of figure out how that grows and develops and use that as a guideline for designing instruction, you can see the transfer of knowledge to other related tasks in the domain. So it's kind of the glue that holds things together at different domains. And using those as a design for development to map out instructional strategies. I did this with young children in terms of their social understanding. So using this notion of understanding other people's intentions to help them construct narratives of how a problem could be solved. So using that as a way and using narrative to help them move forward. And it was successful, as other instructional work in this area has been, in really helping students to consolidate their understanding and then move forward to new understandings. The last study I did in this regard was called the Child Psychologist. And it looked at children from ages 6 to 16, all identified in one way or another as gifted in the academic areas. And we looked at how those children understood themselves as learners. What was their learner identity? How did they understand the constructs of teaching and learning, and how did they understand knowledge? It was really an incredibly informative study to do. The logo actually was designed by one of the participants, an 11-year-old boy who had his own web design company, and who now has a phenomenal social media company in the U.S. that has 45 employees and I think 5 offices at this point in time. Started at the age of 19, so learned a lot.
Well, it looks like he actually started at 11 or before.
Well, indeed, Linda. Yeah, you could see the signs of it. And this is just as an aside, but it's a great story, I think. At 11, he wanted to be a corporate lawyer. Had great plans. It was all laid out very carefully. And I'll talk a little bit more about this project, but he has been followed up. And at the age of 19, he was interviewed about, you said you wanted to be a corporate lawyer. He laughed at that and he said, "Oh, I've just come out of a meeting with my corporate lawyer." So I went with the results of many interviews with kids and discussions with kids about how they like to be taught, how they themselves would teach, how they define learning and what was happening when they were learning. Really pulled it together, and I thought perhaps there's a central conceptual structure that's actually relevant to all of that, which I called the central epistemological structure. So how kids' ways of thinking about knowledge and the way they acquire it develops over time. So at this point, I feel that I'm kind of investigating my own central conceptual structure in a way. bringing together my artistic interests and my academic interests. And I'm doing, I think, or it certainly feels this way, what Robbie Case called the merging of two files as a metaphor for development. And use this to explain how at transitional points in development, we take understandings, two separate understandings that have been developing kind of independently, and we merge them, that merging of the two files. And so this is where I feel I'm kind of at the groundwork of uniting my artistic and academic interests. I have moved into a study, which I'll talk about in a minute, on giftedness in the arts, namely opera. And also moved into arts-based methodology. So looking at the use of portraiture, narrative, and a collaboration with a documentary filmmaker, which I will also get to momentarily. So with Nancy Hermiston, who is the director of the School of Opera here at UBC, and Laurel Parsons, who's a music theorist, we're doing a study called Libretti of Learning. It is examining I want to say effect, but it's not the kind of study that looks at effects, but more an exploration of talking to opera students who have a diagnosed learning disability. Nancy has noticed over the years that she has directed the program that a number of incredibly talented young students actually struggle with aspects of their learning. There's a range of ways in which dyslexia manifests itself, dysgraphia, certainly there's ADHD. And her experience has been that opera, she thinks, in some way supports their learning in interesting ways. She thinks it's the multitasking that's involved in it, because as you can see, this is a shot from Don Giovanni, but there is so much going on that you have to attend to when you're on stage. You know, there's the costumes, there's the movement, there's the other people's parts, there's attending to the conductor without being seen to attend to the conductor. There's the lighting, the audience, even negotiating in some of these costumes is phenomenally complicated. Plus you're singing in different languages. There's many things about it. So, I mean, at this point, we probably have raised a whole pile more questions. But certainly, I think what is coming out loud and clear is that there is something to this multitasking, complex task idea that really is supported in other aspects of literature on individuals who are both gifted and learning disabled. The other piece is the phenomenal passion that these young people have for what they do. I think really gives them a degree of resilience and an amazing focus to really kind of carry on, often in the face of some significant challenges. The other project I'm doing is Superkids 2, and this is with Harry Killis, who's a documentary filmmaker. He's on faculty at MCAR. And we're really working with the premise that film works with personal narrative. So it really capitalizes on what Jerome Bruner has called the landscape of consciousness. And it brings new understanding to students of human development and education, to teachers, to parents, and researchers. And I think we'll eventually go in the direction of to other students as well. About 10 years ago, Harry and his producer, Rick Bierstow, made a film called Superkids, which tracked the process of application to a program that's a collaboration between UBC, the Ministry of Education, and Vancouver School Board, located on campus, the transition program, which is designed to allow highly gifted young adolescents to bridge their elementary through to university experience. They do 2 years in the program with the intent of preparing them to then start university early. And it tracks the process of applicants, 3 applicants to that program, and also told the story of one young man who was already in the program. Not all students chose to go or were accepted to the program, so it's a very interesting examination of family and personal motivation and just the educational options. The whole process is what parents and kids go through in grade 7, trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do the following year. And I've shown this a number of times in classes, and inevitably the question was, well, what happened to these kids? You know, do you know where they are now? So Harry and I kind of put our heads together a couple of years ago, and as of last year, we're successful in getting a development grant to do work on this. And this shows 2 of the young men who were in the original film. Again, we're using film. This is a preliminary study trying to get the groundwork laid for a larger project that will continue to ask important questions of these young people regarding their career choices, the thought process that went into it. On the left, and it is okay for me to identify these participants since they have already been publicly in a documentary, Mendel Spelsky here, who actually ended up going to St. George's for his high school experience rather than into the transition program. You could tell in the original film he wasn't all that committed to the idea. No, I didn't quite get my portfolio ready. So, very interesting. And he has gone on to complete a degree in industrial design. And Chetan Bierstow, who did graduate from the program, did an undergraduate degree here in English, and is now pursuing a second one in music, and is thinking about graduate school. So we are hoping to take this forward after we're still engaged with graduate students in analyzing hours and hours of original footage, new footage, pulling out scenes, transcribing, and so on, to think about what will happen in the next phase of the project. Which brings me, some of you heard me talk about this at the retirement function, but it's really incredible because, for a number of years as I kind of thought this through, I thought, I don't know, I'm not happy with the term. And it's largely because, people sort of assume, they seem to assume that you're going to fade off into the sunset somehow. So, I was influenced by Carl Lego, with whom he's part of a writing collaborative I'm involved in. So I went to etymology and I mean, look at this. It's the act of retreating and withdrawing. And emeritus also, the roots of that, this notion of serving your time and finishing your work and your past service and bye. So, part of my mission is really around this idea of rethinking that, and I don't know that it's the word necessarily that is the problem. I think it's just that as more of us move into this phase of life, perhaps actions will speak louder than words. there's a wonderful chapter in a book on development, lifespan development, that talks about the persimmon's promise, and uses the metaphor of the persimmon tree, which does not bear its fruit until after the first frost. So, and I think it's a great time, as a person with an interest in developmental psych, it's a great time to be retiring, actually, because it's a transition that's getting some attention in the research arena. And we're really looking at the fact that those old stage models are no longer relevant. I mean, Piaget, of course, didn't even think about adult, I mean, after you were formal operational, if you ever became one, you know, that was it. And Erickson's notion of generativity, which was, you know, really, in his model, it was around the age of 50 to 60. So writers now are saying if we were to kind of take that model, all of those, that would be pushed forward a great deal. So we really do, I think, really need to re-examine and conceptualize what we think about this phase of life. For those of you who are interested in the neuroscience of this, and recognize I'm sort of just a novice in neuroscience, I'm sort of just delivering this information, but Gene Cohen, who's a psychiatrist, has written about this. He's done some really interesting work in the US around the role of the arts in later life, and his work on the neuroscientific basis of this work is that in elder adulthood, there is actually more neural density. Our brains have learned more, and we have complex neural architecture. And there is lots of neurogenesis going on. He talks about wisdom equaling developmental intelligence, and really this means the optimal integration of neurological, emotional, intellectual, and psychological capacities in the mature brain. So there's more bilateral brain involvement, so our hemispheres are talking to each other more. New neuron formation in the information part of the brain is associated with a desire for novelty. There's bilateral involvement of the hippocampi that contributes to our capacity for autobiographical expression. And this involvement also helps link the neocortical thinking brain with the limbic feeling brain. And there are also changes in the amygdala that provoke positive emotions and morale. Apparently, the amygdala no longer fire rapidly in the face of emotional stimuli. So in terms of the autobiographical piece, I have been involved with this group of scholars, some from our faculty, one from SFU, one who graduated from our doctoral program in CCFI and has gone on to be faculty at CityU, in writing about teaching, and really from an autobiographical point of view, and kind of examining our own work, both our practice and our inner work as teachers. That book has been published. We are now in the process of writing one on learning, and we have plans to carry on with that, some potential topics. And as I said, the other two projects, I'm hoping to maintain some level of involvement with the opera project and Superkids. So just a few closing thoughts. And of course, in the artistic vein, let's see if we can get this up. I'm not going to, because time is of the essence. So this, if I can send you this link if you would like to see it, but in his 70s, Matisse really went back to his roots, which came from a family of weavers, and the textile industry. He came from a town in northern France where this was really important. He kind of returned to those roots with his artistry and did the most remarkable paper cuts. They are seen as the most important works of his career. The quote I'm going to read is from Hilary Sperling's biography in 2 volumes, where she said in his mid-70s he felt himself approaching clarity, power, and purpose. So I think it really resonates with the work that's being done, for example, by Gene Cohen in terms of potential. So in moving forward, I would really like to continue the explorations of art, writing, and the merging of the arts with research that have been woven through my life as a teacher and a researcher. And thank you for the opportunity to present, and also for the experience of being part of this department. It's been wonderful.
We have some time for comments, questions.
Marion,
Yes.
who was the? Thank you. I heard your talk at the retirement evening, and I think maybe not everyone was here, but that concept of retirement came up, and the evening was not about retirement for, I think, all or maybe one of them.
Yeah.
And the word that I like the way you went back to the definition, because remember, to retire is to go to sleep.
Exactly.
And so I like the way that successful aging is challenging that concept, first off. Second, who was the reference for the neuroscience, neurogenesis? Was that Paulus?
No, Gene Cohen.
Cohen, okay.
It's a 2006 book called The Mature Mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. So I really want to say that just you and I have talked is that I think I mentioned it in that meeting that this would be a really good shirt application for some of us who are in that particular stage of our lives, yourself included, to start the project with faculty, teachers who want to do the guided autobiography for successful aging.
Exactly.
So there may be others. The only thing is you have to be 60 or older to get into the club.
No.
No exclusion here.
Will?
Well, I want to just say thanks too for all that you've done for us as a community, and well, I guess we'll continue to bathe in that babe. Going back to Pat Arlen, and I guess what she was working on here was this notion of fifth stage and kind of problem finding and that sort of thing. And I guess maybe, can you kind of, I mean, are you feeling like that there may be some validity to kind of that sort of stages of development, and in fact there's a development of expertise or a kind of a change of kind?
Yes, I definitely, in fact, I've thought of Pat a lot as I've done other reading. Certainly the word wisdom, she used it as a defining characteristic of that fifth stage. And the problem finding, the creative notion of problem finding, and the reflectivity that I've been reading about too. Those were all things that I think she really was prescient in terms of her thinking about a fifth stage of development.
I just want to thank you. This was very interesting. My only regret is that how little I know and I've known about your work. And so it's too soon to leave. And I hope, as you say, it's not retiring and disappearing, and hope you stay connected.
Oh, plan to.
I have been Lightfoot, the Harvard professor. It's exactly about the kinds of things you talk about, this third chapter of the development. And she talks a little bit about the literature that you referred to and some of the things, the reflectivity, the need for creativity and a need for passion. So caring and passion for things. So I just wanted to thank you, and I wanted to mention this. And if there is going to be a collaborative effort at UBC, I would be most interested in a project that's not biased against ages.
There is going to be a project.
Marion, I'd like to thank you very much for a lovely presentation. And as you were talking, I was wondering, should we be doing something to prepare younger people for this kind of transition? And maybe, I think when I was younger, I wouldn't have understood it, but maybe hearing stories like yours might really help us think about that, and instead of dealing with it when you're faced immediately with it.
I think we've had conversations, Marv and I have had conversations about that too. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a place for it. I wish that I had had that opportunity, and I think that there is a really, the stories are important. I think the story is the more powerful way of going about this. I think it's, you don't want to go that PowerPoint mode of, here are the 3 key points kind of thing, but you're right. I think there's a really big role for that.
There is if we could get younger people thinking about it, while their parents were still alive. So I think we have, many of us, both my parents have died, and I should have been more interested in their stories. And so if we get people thinking about it earlier, before it's too late, that's something that may help.
Joe?
This is all incredibly interesting to me because this goes all the way back to Rousseau, who said, I think and therefore I am. And that has actually been problematic for the Western mind, because in the West, we created words like retirement and emeritus, which create a boundary around what we do. And what you're saying is there's a lot of research trying to take down those barriers and recognize what really potential there is as we age, which our culture, our Western side of society is largely set aside. We put a frame on it, and then we adults, because we're human beings and are influenced by thought, I think, for there I am, we don't realize our potential, and that's the work you're doing, which is so valuable. But in the East, for example, in Japan, there is not that tradition. In fact, they have the opposite view. I don't think, and thus I can be everything. And so in Japan, for example, with that as their ontology, no thought as the guide to one's development, not having thought be a barrier to development, they have established decades ago what's called national treasures. These elderly people who have some art, and they're treasured. The government funds them to do their art and raise, at the age of 70, 80, 90, acolytes, disciples. My wife, for example, was invited to be a disciple of a national treasure who did basketry, magnificent bamboo basketry. So, and if you read the writing of Dogen, like The Mystical Realism, a book by a philosophy professor who studied Dogen, you'd see that there's a whole different train of thought that hasn't put those boundaries on our growth and the growth of wisdom as we move into adulthood. So I think what you're doing is wonderful. But in some ways, I'm suggesting that we're catching up. And the one ironic thing is we're using thought to catch up. And actually, there's another place where no thought releases tremendous insight because the thoughts get in the way of that insight, for what it's worth.
Since you're very close to exiting this place, I'm wondering if you could say, I mean, you've given us kind of a picture of an ongoing thread of research and something that's going to just continue. But obviously you're leaving a position, and you haven't said much about the leaving of positions in regard to the, I mean, you don't have to retire. You've chosen from this institution, but you're choosing to retire.
Right.
How do you see that fitting into the story that you're?
I see it as freed me up to take this journey.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now it's self-guided.
It is, yeah. Well, it's retirement comes with some privileges, you know, you become the professor emerita or emeritus, and so you still have a place here, but you have another place where you're free to really engage in your work without the other things that can really sap our energy.
Just an aside, Marion has graciously accepted to be our departmental representation on the Emeriti committee. Bonnie Long is chairing, who is also a retired professor from our department. So that just came about in the last couple of months.
Just going to say that your work fits into the narrative and mentorship of new faculty. Because I know about your work, and there's a lot of ordinary wisdom that's emerged in this faculty by people who are kind of able to play key roles in mentorship. So, but I think it's the narrative. I agree with you. The stories are more interesting than anything else, and more interesting PowerPoints. And I think the art is also a good point.
I think so too, yeah. Yeah, and the two together, I think.
Best.
The best, yeah.
I also wonder, having been raised in an extended family where my grandparents were very important to me, if linking grandparents and grandchildren, like, you know, more, we have cultures in our society now where they have brought in that importance again, where the extended family is very important. First Nations also connecting grandparents, grandchildren. That whole notion of now as a grandparent, and being very validated in my interactions with my young grandchildren, I think it'd be an interesting combination to get the grandchildren's perspective on how they see that and the grandparents' perspective.
It really would. I was thinking about that actually in terms of Linda's question that, I mean, Denmark, for example, puts, I don't want to use the term old age home, but it's so embedded in our, you know, the seniors' residence next to preschool.
Yeah.
You know, they're in the same community and there's lots of interaction. So, but I think this is a more personalized, wonderful way of thinking about it in terms of the extended family.
And for people who don't have those, there are people who aren't living geographically close to either, and there also can be a way to connect.
Exactly.
Whether they're biologically connected.
Yeah.
Anyway. Any other comments? Well, I was sitting here thinking about our expectations about retirement and the discussions we've had about faculty renewal and the clear statement that we don't necessarily want to replace the people who are retiring with those coming in because it may not have the same needs. And I'm sitting there thinking, we'd be lucky to have somebody who could catch up to what you've been doing. And Ron the same in terms of that. So it's interesting. It's an interesting old concept too about what people might be expected to be doing as they're nearing their age of their paid employment, which doesn't fit.
That's right.
In many ways these days. So it's an interesting, that's another interesting kind of conception to challenge perhaps.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. The language is so powerful.
It is.
Yeah.
I liked what we had in the professor getting together to challenge the retirement age and saying that 65 was an age and an expiry date.
Yeah.